Hello again. There are certain terms that are used in photography that if you have been doing photography for a while, you'll know them and you kind of I just assume everybody else does. But if you're new to photography or you may have heard certain terms that you don't understand, hopefully I'll pick them up in this podcast. So I'm going to go through a dozen questions that I've sort of jotted down here that explain these basic aspects of photography, and hopefully they'll provide a bit of clarification for you. Now, before I start, what I will say is if most of this is new to you, the best thing I can suggest is that you take some form of photography class that goes from the basics, assumes no knowledge, and then work your way through. Because what I've found is when you hit things like photography by, say, asking questions on YouTube or things like that, you'll tend to get your question answered, but often you're missing vital bits of information that are kind of assumed in the explanation that you're given. But if you don't know them, you're going to miss something really important. So there are certain essential building blocks to photography that if you skip any of them can make photography seem very complicated and very difficult. Whereas if you go through a course or a program that takes you through the basics, then that will really open up the full creative potential that you have with your camera. So the first one I'm going to start with is what's the difference between optical and digital zoom? Well, very briefly, optical zoom is what you get with a zoom lens. So you're zooming in on your subject, but you're using the optics in the camera to do it. You're using lenses to do it. What that means to the picture is that if you have, let's say, a 32 meg resolution image, I'm just plucking a number here, so don't read anything into that. However you set that optical zoom, the image that you have is still 32 meg resolution. So you still maximize the resolution of your camera. Digital zoom, on the other hand, pulls apart the pixels that you have in that original image. So it's a bit like if you use the thumb and the finger sort of spreading technique on a smartphone just to make an image look bigger. What you'll find with that is initially when you do it, as you begin to zoom, you do see a bit more detail because what you're doing basically is pulling the pixels apart. But as you keep on going, the picture starts to get very, very blocky. You can begin to see the individual pixels. So the thing is, you're not adding any resolution when you do a digital zoom. You're simply spreading out what's there. Whereas with an optical zoom, you are adding resolution, if you like. You're getting close to your subject, but you're maintaining the full resolution of your camera. So the increase in detail is a real increase in detail. With digital zoom, you're seeing what's there, you're spreading out what's there, so it's a bit easier to see, but you're not adding any detail. So I hope that makes some sense. The next thing I want to talk about is what is depth of field and how is it controlled. Now, I will come back to depth of field in a few of the other questions, but depth of field is one of those things that is really important to understand. And essentially, depth of field just defines what is in focus in your picture. So if you think of a subject, let's think of a person, you might focus on their eye, the eye that's nearest to you, because if you're doing a portrait, focusing on the eye is a great place to focus. And depending on how you've set the depth of field, it might be very narrow. So their nose might be going out of focus in the front, their ears going out of focus at the back. Or you might have a very deep depth of field. So everything in the foreground is in focus. You can clearly see their background. There's no difference in that in any aspect of the photograph. Everything is sharp and in focus. And that's simply depth of field, how much of the image is in focus. Now, I'm going to come back to this, as I've said. So in some situations, you do want your background to be really sharp. In other situations, though, you might want to draw the viewer's eye to a certain aspect of your photograph. So it might be the eyes of the person that you're photographing. So it's great to have the background out of focus a little bit. How out of focus is really up to you. And also potentially foreground objects, because the depth of field works around the subject. It's I'm not going to go into exactly how in this podcast, but it's not quite even. So what influences the depth of field? Well, one is the focal length of the lens you're using. another important aspect is how far you are from, or how far away the camera is to your point that you're focusing on. So let's say this person's eye. And then the final thing is the aperture setting that you're using. And I like to have depth of field as my primary control, so I use aperture priority. So those three things, though, the focal length, the lens, the distance from your subject, and the aperture you're using will define the depth of field that you achieve. So how much of the picture is in sharp focus. Okay, so what's the difference between a large and a small aperture? So this is basically, if you think of it as the hole in the lens that allows light through is one way of thinking of it. Using the aperture you control, you can make that hole very wide as the lens will support, or you can stop it down, which means you're making that hole much smaller, much narrower. And really there are two things that affects. One is the amount of light reaching the sensor or the film in the camera. So obviously with the aperture wide open, you've got the maximum amount of light coming in. So if you're in a dark environment, you might want to open up to the biggest aperture you can. Now that will have a number on it, and that will be a small number. It might be 1.2 would be a very big aperture. It might be 2.8, could be something like that. But that kind of a number means that the physical hole, if you like, that the light is coming through is as big, or you're getting towards as big as the lens will support. On the other hand, a small aperture obviously will not let much light in at all. So it might be you're in an environment that's very, very bright. And one way to control the amount of light that's hitting the sensor and how quickly the sensor is responding to what it's seeing through the lens is to stop down so that hole is very, very small. And that might be something like an f16, f22, those kind of numbers. That means that the hole is very, very small. Now, the other thing that happens with aperture, and I've just spoken about it in the last question, is it influences your depth of field. So with a big aperture, when you're using, say, f2.8 as a number, and the aperture is very big, it means your depth of field is very narrow. So the area that's in focus, in front of and behind the point that you focused on your subject, that will be very narrow. So this is where you would achieve, if you're focused on somebody's eye, that's where their nose will be out of focus, tip of their nose, maybe their ears are out of focus in the background. That would be a very large aperture with a small number. So it might be f2 or 2.8. On the other hand, when you have a very narrow aperture, so when you stop it right down, when you're using f16 or f22, pretty much everything will be in focus. So that's what aperture does for you. It controls the amount of light hitting your sensor, and it controls how deep your depth of field is. Okay, so number 4 is, how do I get a blurry background? Now, I've pretty much answered this, but it's a question I get asked a lot. And it's simply controlling depth of field. It's controlling aperture. So if you're not sure about how that works, what I suggest you do is switch your camera to aperture priority mode, and then just go out and pick a subject, stay the same distance from it, but just change the aperture. With aperture priority, the camera will compensate with shutter speed so that you get the right exposure. But just vary the aperture a little bit, make it smaller, make it larger, and look at what happens to how much of the photograph is in focus. So it's good to maybe have someone standing in front of a background object, maybe an object that's a bit further away, and just play with that and look at the difference. But that's how you do it, basically. Okay, on autofocus, what's the difference between single and continuous autofocus? Well, with single autofocus, what you're doing, usually when you press the shutter button halfway, the autofocus will focus on what it thinks is your subject, and that's determined by how you've set up the autofocus points in the camera. But with it set to default, normally that's the center of what you can see. That would be your autofocus point. So when you press the shutter halfway down and you're in single autofocus, that sets your focus. And then when you push the shutter button all the way down, that takes your photograph. Now, that's fine if your subject isn't moving. So if you're doing a portrait of somebody and they're just sitting stationary, that's fine. That's all you need. Continuous autofocus means that once you've got your finger pressed down, the camera is continuously refocusing on the subject. And this is where you would be focusing on a subject that's moving. So this might be moving towards you or away from you. Obviously, that would then change the focal distance because your subject's either further away or closer. And continuous autofocus basically allows you to track your subject and keep it in focus. Now, if you're focusing on something that's moving very fast, the chances are that your autofocus won't be able to keep up with it. So there are definitely limits to how quickly the autofocus in the camera can respond, but that's essentially what the difference is. Okay, number 6. You've taken a photograph of the sunset, but it doesn't look very colourful. Well, there's a couple of things you can do there. One thing to remember is that when you're looking at something, you're using the combination of your eyes and your brain to interpret what's there. And as it gets darker, let's say, so a sunset, the light will be dropping. Your eyes are automatically opening further and further so that you can take in more light and you still get a clear picture of what's going on to a certain light level. And your brain is also compensating for what's going on around you. Obviously, a camera doesn't do that. It will just work with what it's given based on the settings it's running with, whether you set them manually or whether they're automatic. So that's the first thing. What your camera is seeing quite often isn't what you're seeing. Sunsets often look much not as vivid as you might remember them, and that's one of the reasons why. It's just the way the camera is responding to the light. Now, the other thing is a thing called white balance, and white balance compensates for, they call it temperature, and I don't want to overcomplicate this, but essentially certain times of day you get more of a red hue, which you would tend to at sunset. Other times of day, let's say middle of the day, it's much brighter. So the white, a white panel would look slightly different in that lighting. So what white balance is doing is trying to make whites look natural. And you can change them on your camera. You can also do it in post-processing, depending on what you're using. But one thing you might want to do in a sunset situation is to just set your white balance to cloudy. So that just changes the way that white is represented or what the camera takes as a reference white. It just changes it for the light conditions. Now, having said that, I tend not to change my white balance. Other photographers do it. Really, it comes down to what works for you and what gets you the results that you want. I change white balance in post-processing, but again, not very often. Another thing is tungsten lighting. That's another thing that can give a blue tint to what you're seeing, and that's just because the white a white reference would look different under tungsten lighting than it would in bright sunlight, because sunlight has more yellows in it. So it comes down to what colours are making up the white that you see, and is there a bias towards one colour or another. So in the case of tungsten, it might be blue. In the case of sunset, it might be orange. And the camera won't automatically compensate for that. So you might get colours that look wrong. Okay, I hope that's helped. Okay, number 7. How can I avoid red eye in photos? Well, red eye is caused when your flash gun is basically positioned right above the center of your lens and quite close to the camera. So what happens is that light sent from the flash gun reflects off the pupils in the subject's eye and then comes back. And what it does, it lights up all the blood vessels in the eye. So that's what you see reflected back. So you get that red eye. With some cameras, you get a red kind of pre-flash. So when you press the shutter down to take the photo, you actually get a pulse of light sent to the subject, and then the final flash, that is when the camera takes the picture. And what that bright pulse does is it actually closes down the pupils in the subject's eyes, so those blood vessels aren't so visible. So that's one way you might be able to get around it. A much better way is to use, if you're using a flash gun, is to use a flash gun with a bounce tilt head, so that you can bounce the flash off the ceiling, for example, or off a wall, something like that. So the light is no longer going directly at the subject and being reflected directly back. It's taking a longer route, and that way you don't get that reflection. Another way is to avoid using a flash altogether. Just use a very high ISO with a wide aperture. So we've been talking about wide apertures. So that lets as much light in as possible. And depending upon how much light is available, that might work for you. And another way is just to simply correct it with post-processing. Most post-processing packages have an option to get rid of red eye. So you just bring your cursor over to the eyes of that person, and the software will take care of it for you. So there's different ways of dealing with it, but the fundamental thing is to understand what's causing it, and then you can do something about it. Okay, number 8, the histogram. Now, you've probably got a histogram that pops up on the back of your camera when you've taken a photograph, and it's possible that you haven't got a clue what that's trying to tell you. So if you look at the histogram, or if you think of what it looks like, if you take the axis along the bottom, basically that's going from dark on the left-hand side to light on the right. So if you think of it, the extreme right is a pure black, the extreme left is a pure black, the extreme right is a pure white, so it's as bright as you can get. And then the vertical axis is how many pixels you have in that photograph at each of the positions between those two extremes. It's a way of showing whether or not you've got a good exposure, or what the camera thinks is a good exposure, but technically correct exposure. And what you should see is something like a bathtub curve, so an inverted bathtub, so low at the extremes but higher in the middle, with a nice even spread. And that means that most of your pixels are in the area of kind of middle light. So they're slightly, they might be dark or they might be lighter, but they're evenly spread. You don't have any peaks of pixels at either side. So either peaks in the black or peaks in the white. So that's what a good one looks like. If you find that you've got most of your pixels at one end or the other, it means that you're either over or underexposed. And so remembering that the left-hand axis, the vertical axis on the left, is your dark axis, that's your black. If most of the pixels are over at that side, the chances are you've got an underexposed picture. It may not be, depends what you're photographing, but it's certainly saying that that image is very dark. And the opposite of that is to have the peaks over at the right-hand edge, so it might even be climbing the sides. That means you've got a very bright image, so the chances are you're overexposed. So it's incorrect exposure. Now, another thing coupled to that with some cameras is that you may also get your it will show you the picture you've just taken, but there might be white or black areas marked that are flashing within that picture. And what that means is that those areas, the white areas, the camera is telling you are overexposed. And if you've got black areas that are flashing, then it's underexposed. So that's simply what the camera is telling you. So in some ways, that's a bit more helpful perhaps than the straight histogram. It's showing you that certain parts of the picture are not correctly exposed. Now, that might be fine. In fact, in most cases, it probably is. But the camera's just trying to tell you what's going on. So again, I hope that's made a little bit of sense. It is a difficult thing to explain without a picture. I will say that. Okay, the 9th one I'm going to talk about is why is my subject out of focus? So there are some reasons for this. I mean, obviously you might have your focus incorrectly set. I'm going to assume that it's correctly set. So what are the other things that can cause an image to be out of focus? Well, one is your shutter speed might be too slow, particularly if either your subject is moving or you're moving for some reason. So that can happen if you knock a tripod when you're taking a long exposure, or I remember standing on a bridge taking pictures of Circular Quay, but it was a road bridge and there was a vibration from vehicles going by, and that can be enough just to create a little bit of vibration and make the final picture out of focus, slightly out of focus. So check your shutter speed essentially to eliminate motion blur. There is a guideline, I guess, for how slow a shutter speed you can get away with when you're hand holding your camera, and that is to use 1 over the focal length of your lens. So if you're using a lens with a focal length of 100 millimeters, 1 over 100, obviously 100th of a second, that would be the slowest shutter speed that you can reliably, most people anyway, use and still have a sharp picture. So generally I would go a bit faster. So if I was using a 100 millimeter lens and I wanted to make sure I didn't get any camera shake in there, I might shoot at 1/200th of a second, 1/400th of a second, something faster than 1/100th of a second. I certainly wouldn't go slower than 1/100th of a second. So for example, if I was shooting at 1/50th of a second, hand holding with a 100mm lens, there is a chance that I'm going to get some camera shake, some motion blur in there. So that's a guide for you. Now, the other thing that might throw you off is having a very narrow aperture. So remember, very narrow depth of field. So that's set by the aperture, and the depth of field is simply how much of the image is in focus in front of and behind what you've focused on. So if your aperture is very narrow, and it might be that you're very close to your subject, it might be that it's let's say in the example I was given them of focusing on somebody's eyes, if you're quite close and you've got a very wide aperture, the area immediately in front of their eyes, so they're not even going as far as the nose, and immediately behind might look blurry, so that might begin to look a bit strange. So that's another thing that can lead you to have photographs that aren't very sharp. Okay, number 10, how do I get a sharp background? So this applies generally when you're doing landscape photography. That would tend to be when you'd want to have a nice sharp background. And the obvious thing there, as we've been talking about aperture quite a lot in this podcast, is to have a very small aperture. So you remember that would be something like an f/16 or an f/22 or even f/32, that depends on the lens. That will make the aperture very small. That means everything is in sharp focus, but it does mean that you need to have a very low shutter speed, because remember that hole, the aperture in the lens that allows the light through, is really small. So that means to compensate for that, you need to have a slower shutter speed. So it may be that you have to think about using a tripod or something like that, just to keep the camera nice and steady while you are taking your photograph. Okay. Number 11 is, why are some of my photographs grainy? So what I mean by that is that they look kind of blocky. Noisy is another expression for it, but particularly, and it shows particularly where you have a single block of color. So it might be a sky or a cloud or something like that, or the sea, where you've got a large area of one color. It might look spotty. That's probably the best way to describe it. And what's happening is you're beginning to see individual pixels, and what you're also seeing is noise caused by the camera itself getting into the sensor, getting into the final picture. And usually that happens because your ISO, your sensitivity, is set too high. So it will depend on the camera you're using, and newer cameras are generally better than older cameras, but let's say your ISO is higher than, say, 1600, it might be 3200, 6400. Certainly once you get to those kind of numbers and go higher on your ISO, you would use those where there's very low light, but it does mean that you're much more likely to get that grainy effect, that noisy effect on your photograph. So if you're getting that, try reducing the ISO. You're probably going to have to change your aperture and your shutter speed. So chances are you'll definitely have to shoot at a slower shutter speed. So you might need to think about using a tripod and just using a low ISO with a long exposure, and do everything on a tripod. Incidentally, Most cameras have a self timer, and a lot of them have a 3-second self timer and a 10-second self timer. Where you would typically use those, the 10-second allows you to press the shutter button and then kind of run in front of the camera and be a part of the picture. The 3-second just allows you to press the shutter button and then keep your hands away from the camera when the shutter actually releases. So it's if you don't have a cable release or some other way of reducing or pressing the shutter button without physically pressing the shutter button, use the 3-second self timer on the camera, and that's one way of getting around that. Okay, and the final thing is, what is a lens hood for? Well, I use it for a couple of things actually. So the main reason for having it is that when you're in a situation where there's bright light can get inside the lens, and most certainly longer lenses and certainly professional lenses, the high quality lenses, are made up of several lenses. So that you've got the lens itself and obviously the lens at the front, lens at the back, but there are other elements, other lenses within that the overall lens assembly. So that's why some of them feel quite heavy. And what happens is that you get what we call lens flare, but it's basically reflections that are caused between the different elements within the lens body itself. And so they obviously create usually unwanted effects on the final photograph. So the idea of the lens hood, and you'll notice depending on the focal length of the lens, you'll notice some of them are fairly short, others are very long, and that will be directly related to the focal length of the camera and also the angle of view. So that's why you get those funny shapes sometimes, because a very long telephoto will have a very narrow angle of view. It might be, less than 10 degrees wide, but on a wide angle, you've got a huge width. So I don't know what that would be, 60 degrees wide, maybe, I don't know, but hopefully you get the idea. So the primary use of the lens hood is to stop light coming in and creating these unwanted reflections, this lens flare, these spots of light that appear on the final image. Now, bear in mind, I'm sort of coming from a wildlife perspective here. The other reason I tend to use it a lot is that if I'm, certainly when I was photographing humpback whales, but also when I'm in a four-wheel drive, often the camera will swing. It can be when you're carrying it, or if you've got it around your shoulder. If it swings, it tends to be the end of the camera that will hit things first, which is normally the lens. But if you've got the lens hood on, it means the lens hood is the thing that makes contact with whatever you're going to make contact with, which is usually metal. It's usually hard, and it's usually not a good idea to hit the lens directly against it, because even if you don't directly damage the lens, you can upset the alignment of those elements inside the lens assembly, and that means you've got to have the lens disassembled and realigned and all of that, and that's not cheap. So that's the main reason why I almost always have my lens hood on the lens. It's not so much to stop this flare occurring within the lens, but it's more to just protect the lens assembly and make sure that if I do have a little bash against something, that gets absorbed by the plastic in the lens hood and it doesn't hit the metal of the lens assembly. So I use metal lenses, so metal bodies, so that makes them a bit more rugged, but also heavier, which is the downside. And if you've got a plastic lens body, I'd definitely recommend using the lens hood just as a way of protecting it from any, as carefully as you are, you always get knocks and scrapes and that kind of thing going on. Okay, so that really summarizes, or that completes, I should say, that podcast. There were just a dozen things that I've been asked about from time to time, or similar questions, or the same question phrased differently, and hopefully that's given you some insights and some useful tips to help you with your own photography. But as I said at the start, if you have found most of this to be new information, I would recommend that you find a good camera course, and I do some photography courses of my own, so you're welcome to drop me an email about that at graham@ge.photography. And that my courses take you through everything, give you lots of practice examples to do, little tasks to do, so that you really get clear and familiar with that aspect of photography before you move on to the next one. Okay, so that's it from me. I hope you have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I'll speak to you in the next podcast. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.